Good morning, everyone. Laura, I see you're off mute, so I'll just pick on you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly, Bloss. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, we'll get started in just a minute. We have a few more people just logging on. And William, I forgot to ask, where are you based now?
I am based in Irvington, New York, which is a little bit north of New York City, and it's
Sure.
it's beautiful here.
How did you end up there?
Somewhat randomly. I think I've sort of ended up somewhat randomly everywhere I've moved. I've been wrong about every place I thought I would end up. So I remember thinking once when I was about 20 or maybe 19, I was thinking, I was in London. I just thought, this is the best place ever. Why would I ever leave? And then a few months later, I was living in New York. And then I remember thinking, why would I ever leave this place? This is just great. And then I ended up in Boston, and then I ended up back in New York, and then I ended up in Hong Kong. And then my wife said to me, should we put a chip in our dog in case we ever move to London? And I'm like, we're never moving to London. And so she ignored me and put a chip in the dog. And then we moved to London a few months later. So the one thing that's been clear is that I've been consistently wrong about this absolutely fundamental thing of where I would end up. So you guys should definitely listen to me. My predictive powers are extraordinary.
And your wife seems very wise.
Much wiser than me, I think. And she spends so little time wrestling about all of these deep existential ideas, you know, and actually, I think she's like, yeah, it's all pretty simple. And so, yeah, I basically spend my whole time agonizing to figure out things that she figured out like 50 years ago without any trouble.
Well, round two will then be with Mrs. Green.
Exactly. Who was also smart enough not to take my name. She's like, yeah, no, I'm Cooper. So.
Fantastic. Well, William, if you're good, let's get started. And if a couple people pop in later, I'll just admit them on the side. But real pleasure to have you here today. And just a bit of context for the group who probably doesn't need it. But, well, you spent the last 25 years in interviewing some of the world's great investors. And if I understand it correctly, the thread you've been pulling on is what makes them sustainably great. And besides this book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, that we'll dig into today, I was really interested to learn that you helped Guy Spier write The Education of a Value Investor, which to me was one of my favorite books. I read it probably 8 or 10 years ago at this point, but it feels like a self-mastery book disguised as an investing book. In a really similar vein, I think this book is a philosophical book or a spiritual book disguised as an investing book. And I love to pull on that thread a little bit with you and how maybe Stoicism and Buddhism and Judaism might have played a role in your thinking in this book. And we'll love to learn, start there and learn from you.
Yeah, and if you think about it, Guy's subtitle for his book is I think, my transformative quest for wealth, wisdom, and enlightenment. And I'm pretty sure I wrote that line. I mean, after with ghostwriting, collaborating, it's a very deep sort of partnership. And so if you think about what we were wrestling with and trying to sum up what Guy was doing, that's totally the same as what I'm doing in saying richer, wiser, happier. And actually originally, I think for a few years, the title of my book was going to be Wealth, Wisdom, and Happiness. And so we're definitely engaged in the same pursuit. And I think it's one of the reasons why Guy is one of, if not my closest friend. It's because I think we've been engaged in this pursuit. But again, in terms of my blindness about most things, when I first met Guy 20 something years ago, I didn't really like him. And so one of the great ironies is that one of my closest friends is actually someone who I didn't particularly like. And he sometimes says, well, I was sort of a prick in those days. But actually, I think there was something about each other that sort of repelled us. And I think gradually, because we've tried to improve over the years, and that's really central to both of us, is actually trying to improve as human beings. I think there is a sort of parallel journey there. And so I've learned a great deal from Guy. So yeah, I'm very happy to chat about that, because he's been one of the great forces for good in my life, actually.
That's beautiful. But yeah, getting back to a spiritual book disguised as an investing book, how does, you mentioned specifically Judaism and Buddhism and Stoicism, and even David Hawkins, which I've dug into, but you don't hear people talk about too often. How have you woven all those together into what I thought was a really great book?
Thank you. Well, it's all interconnected, really. And I remember having this discussion with Nick Sleep. and him saying, well, look, it's sorry, I have the sun shining in my eyes here. And he said, look, it's investing is a kind of metaphysical and spiritual quest. And these ideas that he and I discussed about quality and about how you behave, they really run through everything. And so I think investing is just a kind of subset of how to live and how to think and try to be a better person. And so one of the things that I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read the book yet, but one of the things that I got most excited by was actually when I was writing about Joel Greenblatt and about simplicity. And I started, and because I have these weird interests that I can't quite explain, that sort of veer off in multiple directions, as I started to see what Joel was doing, and that one of his great talents was this ability to synthesize and distill wisdom and really actually the complexity of the investing game, to distill it down to its very essence. I started to get really excited and to think, well, that's exactly what we're doing in all of these other areas. And when you're writing a book, there's this weird thing that you're writing in a vacuum, so you have no idea whether other people are going to think you're nuts and whether it's going to resonate with anyone. And at the same time, you're sort of years late on your deadline, so you're sort of in this total panic, thinking, "Oh, fuck, what's going to happen here?" And here I am going off on this sort of wild digression. But the digression in this area was really thrilling to me intellectually, because and this really came largely from my study of Kabbalah, which is something that I've studied for the last sort of 13 years, I'd say. So what I became fascinated by as I was studying Greenblatt is I thought, okay, so there's this teaching that there are 613 commandments in the Old Testament, and no one really knows what they are, I think. I mean, I'm no great expert, so you can just, I'm vaguely right here, hopefully. But so there are 613, and then I was thinking, well, none of us really can live our life by 613 commandments. It's just too complicated. So then there's this top 10 list, right? The 10 commandments. So then I'm thinking, okay, let me try to figure out what they are. And I got like about 6 of them right. And then I was like, actually, I'm even kind of probably lying to myself, which is not appropriate when I'm trying to figure out the number of 10 commandments. And then I'm like, well, there's this great sage Hillel, who 2000 years ago is said to have been asked, how would you sum up the entire Old Testament, the Torah, in the time that you can stand on one leg? And he said, do not do what is hateful to others, or do not do what is hateful to you. Sorry, you can tell my coffee hasn't kicked in yet. But essentially saying, the golden rule, it's basically, behave to others the way you want them to behave to you. And then I'm like, well, actually in the Torah, in the Old Testament, there's literally this phrase, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," which basically translates as, and you shall love your fellow, your neighbor, your friend as yourself. And so I thought, that's really extraordinary that the whole thing can actually be distilled down to 3 words in Hebrew. And it's just about how you treat other people. Just, and I talked to Tom Gaynor about this, and he's like, yeah, well, look, Tom grew up Quaker and it's Episcopalian. And he's like, yeah, do love your God, love your neighbor. That's it. That's the whole thing. And then I'm thinking, well, I'm no great scientist. I basically sort of started to flunk out of science when I was about 15. But when I start to read about science, I'm like, well, it's really interesting that you have this sort of 14th or 15th century friar, William of Ockham, saying, Occam's razor principle, saying, the simplest solution is usually correct. And then I'm thinking, well, then you look at something like the Google homepage, and you have like this little lozenge and a logo, and you just type in your search. And so what could be simpler? And then I'm thinking, oh, well, Steve Jobs is saying, that everything just should be super simple. And Dean Ornish, who's one of the great sort of experts on nutrition and health, was friends with Steve Jobs. And I interviewed him for another project. And Ornish said, well, Steve was really proud of what he stripped away, of the things that he didn't put into Apple. So I'm thinking, oh, so there's simplicity there. And then Dean Ornish said to me, basically, you can sum up everything I've learned from 45 years of research on nutrition and health to say, well, you should eat better, eat well, love more, exercise more, stress less. So basically, I think I'm getting it mostly right. So basically, here's this guy who synthesized the whole of his nutritional and exercise research into 8 words. And so I'm starting to think, well, so there's got to be some kind of master principle at work here, which is the ability to synthesize and distill things into something that's somewhat, that's sort of approximately true, at least over time. And so that really fascinated me, that essentially, it seems to me that in an extremely complex world where we don't know that much, if you can distill things and reduce things to a few simple guidelines that are approximately true over time, that's enormously helpful. And I think for me, that's particularly helpful because, as you can probably tell from our conversation already, my mind is kind of going all over the place. And look, I can't even control my bookshelf over here. And sometimes I like need to read a book and I'm like, oh, fuck it, I better just buy the book again, even though I've got it, because it'll take me so long to find it. And so, you know, I'm kind of constantly trying to rein in this sort of errant brain that like craves order, but can't quite get it. And so I think that process of distilling all of these ideas that are they're kind of spiritual ideas, really. It's how do you make your way through a complex world in a way that's decent and honorable, where despite all of our flaws and foibles, you're kind of becoming a better person. And so for me, it's all interconnected. And so your approach of like this lattice work approach, this idea that everything is connected, just deeply resonates with me. I think it's, you know, but as Charlie Munger says, you know, maybe for most people, it's better to specialize. And, you know, you want your proctologist not necessarily to be reading Proust. But for me, because my mind is all over the place and because I have these weird interests, I think that's a strength. And so for me, I'm trying to play the game that I can win, which is one of kind of my mind's everywhere. I'm making connections that probably most people aren't making. I'm losing ideas the whole time. I mean, you know, at one point during this book, I was like, I can't even find my interview that I had with Peter Lynch. Like, I have no idea where it is. And, you know, so it's this constant wrestle to distill stuff despite this kind of slightly broken, glitchy brain. Sorry, that's a very digressive answer to your question.
No, that's exactly why we're here. And I forget who said it, but on, you know, the gist being, for the complexity on this side of simplicity, I wouldn't give a fig, but for the complexity on the other side, I would give anything. And I think that ability to distill and synthesize and simplify, it's a mark of a true master, right? And I love that chapter, both with Greenblatt. I mean, I think it's a thread throughout all of it, but yeah, that simplicity aspect is enormous.
And I think if there's, I'm always embarrassed to tell people what I think is true, because so often the things that are true are kind of so simple that you risk sounding banal. But I think one thing that I would encourage you all to do, because you're all obviously very sophisticated thinkers and very knowledgeable, and this is kind of low-hanging fruit, is I think this process of distilling things through writing is incredibly powerful. And this is something that I've discussed with Guy a lot, that Guy often says to me, you know, yeah, therapy is really, really helpful, but actually the most transformative thing for me has been to write. That I think that there's something about the process of writing that forces you to work your way through these very complex ideas and distill them. And so I think even these things like saying, let me write a list of principles, of operating principles that I live by, is a very helpful, or investment principles that I live by, things that I think are approximately true. And I keep thinking of this wonderful phrase that I think I may have stolen from Esquire from many years ago, which is, how do I define it exactly? I was sort of thinking, sort of this much I know, that it's like, okay, there's not very many things that I know, but this much I know. And just to sort of summarize, okay, well, in a really murky world, what do I really know? And I think one of the things, when I keep trying to distill it down, I think one of the things that's really clear to me is I want to become kinder, and I want to become more compassionate. I want to become more loving and more sharing. Like And there's this wonderful quote that I have on my wall here. One of the ways I rein my brain in, it's by having lots of quotes and post-its and stuff on my wall. And so there's this one that's just to my side here, that's from David Hawkins, that says, I think this is from Power versus Force, but I've read many of his books many times, but it says, simple kindness to oneself and all that lives is the most transformational force of all. It produces no backlash, has no downside, and never leads to loss or despair. It increases one's true power without exacting any toll. But to reach maximum power, such kindness can permit no exceptions, nor can be practiced with the expectation of some selfish gain or reward. And its effect is as far-reaching as it is subtle. There's immense wisdom in that idea. And actually, it's really fascinating, that first line where he says, simple kindness to oneself and all that lives is the most transformational force of all. Because that also gets back to that question of Hillel, which is, don't do to others what you wouldn't have them do to you, or love thy neighbor as thyself. So if you're not kind and loving to yourself, then why would you want to treat other people as shittily as you treat yourself? And so for me, having grown up in England in this very tough sort of intellectual environment where I went to Eton, right, where people like Boris Johnson, David Cameron went, and you would literally sit in a room with 200, 220 other people, and they would read from 220 up to number one out loud where you came in the class. So this is sort of the ultimate, I have no idea whether they do it now, I suspect not. So this is the ultimate sort of outer scorecard environment where you're just thinking, how do I beat the other people? And am I as good as the other people? And I can't believe that guy's smarter. And I can't believe that I'm embarrassed by my own failure and stupidity. And so, and so in a sense, it's kind of rewiring myself to think, okay, so I have to be kinder to others, but actually I also have to try to be kinder to myself. And so just the constant coming back to that sort of thing that I think is very simple, but actually very profound, deep truth is for me, very helpful. And I think for me anyway, it goes through a different part of my brain when I write stuff down. And so I would often sit in a class or a lecture as an adult, because I was sort of constantly trying to learn stuff. And I would write more notes than anybody I've ever encountered. And I think part of it's self-soothing, but part of it is it's actually going through a different part of my brain. And so, but that process of writing down, I would really encourage you to do. And things like something like even writing a do not do list, to say, okay, let me think of the things that I'm not going to do in future. That's, I think, a very powerful process that most of us probably don't do. And I, of course, if I do these things, then lose the list. But I think still having done it is pretty helpful.
The hand-mind connection is so powerful, right? For however many millions of years we've been, direct contact with throwing something and catching something with our hands, and that act of physically writing it down seems so important. William, I think what you're just saying might tie in well into Monish and cloning, and people have an incredible need or desire, it feels like, to make things more complicated, more complex rather than simple, right? And they take great pride in trying to invent something new rather than copying what works. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you learned from Monish, and maybe pull on that thread? Why is it hard to copy something when if it works, right? Why not just copy what works in the world and do more of that?
Yeah, it's a very profound idea. And again, like many great truths, I think is deeply simple. I do think truth tends to be very simple. I may be wrong, but Hawkins says the same thing. And I don't know, when I look at some of the great Kabbalists like Rav Ashlag, who's one of the giants, he'll sum things up with such a simplicity and such a purity that it's very exquisite. And so I think we tend, maybe it's a form of pride and ego. We tend to want to be complicated and sophisticated and to reinvent the wheel and to say, look at me, look how original I am. And I think that's great. And look, I mean, it's why there are so many great works of art and so many great inventions and all of that. But I think it means we miss the low-hanging fruit, which is to say, what if people who are smarter and wiser than me already figured out that I don't actually have to reinvent? And I remember Guy once saying to me while we were working on the educational value investor, he said every time he had this great revelation of something that he figured out, God, I can't believe this. I've actually figured out something. He would then discover that Buffett had figured out 40 years before. And so even when we think we're being original, we then just discover, nah, someone smarter than me already figured this out. And so I think there's something beautiful about Monish's idea of systematically looking at what other people who are smarter than us and wiser than us have already figured out and making the most of it. But I think there are a few caveats. One of which is, I think you have to do it in a way that's true to yourself. And I try to write about this at the end of that chapter about Monish, where I talk about the fact that if, for example, when Monish had something like 50% of his fund in I think it was Fiat Chrysler and GM warrants, a guy looked at this and was like, he's going to destroy himself. What the hell is he doing? And Guy owned both of those things, but he probably had 25% of his assets in them. And I think that was still a little scary, but it suited Guy's temperament. And so I think you want to clone, you want to figure out, what are other people doing that's already really smart, but you want to do it in a way that's deeply aligned with who you are. And so you have to, so there's this tension here that often, I think with things that are true, the opposite is also true, right? So you want to clone from others and you also want to be true to yourself. Those are things that sound, then there's that beautiful F. Scott Fitzgerald line, right? About the definition of intelligence, or one mark of intelligence is the ability to hold contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time without going nuts, basically. And so the cloning idea has been of great practical use to me. And I thought at a certain point, well, this is really a book about cloning. It's really a book about me distilling the best ideas that other people have already figured out. But I think you can do it in small ways and big. So even for something really minor, when I was trying to figure out, okay, what should my website be? I look and WilliamGreen.com's gone. And so I think, what's Michael Lewis done? And so I look at his website and it's michaellewiswrites.com. So I'm like, okay, WilliamGreenWrites.com. So I just immediately cloned that. And then I was really happy to see that my friend Malia, who's a writer and originally from Hawaii, had done MaliaBoydWrites.com. And I was like, yeah, that's good. She just nailed it. And I remember a few weeks ago, we were scheduling some event. I think I was scheduling it with Guy. It was a Clubhouse event or something like that. And I said, we were like, what time do you think we should do it? And I just said, oh, well, the Harvard Club schedules its events at this time. He was like, okay, that's the time. And so it was like, we didn't even wrestle over it or agonize about it for 7 seconds. We just thought, some really smart people at the Harvard Club have figured out what time people get out of work, what time, we didn't have to discuss any of that. We just both understood that's the shortcut way to do this. So I think there are some really wonderful kind of quick and easy things where you can clone. And then there are these really sophisticated things where you have to sort of say, so I think one of the most important things that's had a deep and enduring effect on me was seeing when Monish was saying, for his reading of Power versus Force by David Hawkins is, let me just be truthful, like that people smell when you're lying. And so that became a kind of master idea for Monish, that he just wasn't going to lie. So when I sort of said to Monish, what's your net worth? He would say, well, it's $153 million, but that doesn't include this, this, and this. And there's something kind of really wonderfully clarifying about this. And so I've cloned that. So there was a thing where I had a situation actually with Monish recently where he was going to help me with something. I thought about that idea of truthfulness, and I actually laid out how this thing that I wanted to do was going to serve me and not serve him, and was against his interests. And I said, so here's the way you can do it that would help me most. And here's why that's not good for you. And he immediately made the decision to do it contrary to his self-interest and in favor. And it was like this really wonderful intellectual experiment where it's like, wow, this actually works if you're actually truthful. It works. And so that's something that I've tried to clone from him. And it's incredibly simplifying. Like if I come on this call and I'm not thinking, I hope they buy my book, and I hope they think I'm smart, and I hope I don't look too fat, and I hope the coffee has kicked in. If instead I'm just thinking, let me try to just be truthful and authentic, and it's actually incredibly simplifying. And it means you don't really have to remember what you've lied about or how you've spun things or trying to be consistent. And so I think that's one of those deep truths that's profoundly worth cloning. But I also think Monish has taken that one truth from Power versus Force in a very characteristic way, that he should just be more truthful. And I think about some of the lessons from Power versus Force that I think he's missed. And I'm like, okay, so if all of these things, like virtues like kindness, compassion, love, mercy, calibrate at a much higher level than things like hatred, anger, shame, greed. And even I suspect that as I'm saying those words, you actually have a kind of it has a physiological impact on you. It actually, some of those words make you go weak and some of those words make you go strong. I'm like, so let me just flood the zone with trying to be kinder and more loving and more compassionate, because those things calibrate at such a high level compared with things like shame and anger. And that was actually a really big revelation for me from reading Hawkins, was that actually these traditional approaches to life that I've taken as an English sort of public schoolboy, private schoolboy in most people's parlance, like guilt, self-flagellation, self-loathing, let me beat myself up because then I can push myself to achieve more. Actually, those things calibrate at such a low level that it's much more powerful to come from a place of saying, let me just be kinder and more compassionate, more loving. And I fail at that the whole time. Like you should see me when I'm bad tempered with my kids, or when I can't get the TV to work, and it's like, we're a fucking fraud, But then even then, I'm like, so I start to get mad at myself, and I start to be ashamed of myself, and I start to think, actually, I need to kind of let go of that and try to learn the lesson and be self-compassionate and move forward. And so I think with all of these things, you're cloning, you're distilling, you're synthesizing the best ideas, but the way that I've done it there is different than the way Monish has done it. So I think for Monish to be truthful is probably, I don't know if this is true. I was going to say that it's more important than for him to be kind, but I actually think there's a deep kindness to Monish that's kind of concealed by this tough exterior. I actually think Monish is a very kind person, so I don't want to oversimplify, but I just think it's interesting what he latched onto is different than what I latched onto. So I think when you're studying this stuff, you want to be learning from people who are better and smarter and wiser and older, and so have just solved the problem before you. But you want to say, yeah, for me, this is really the priority. And that goes for investing as well, right? And so for me, when I saw Matthew McLennan's phrase about resilient wealth creation, I'm like, that's me. That's what I want. I'm not looking to hit the ball out of the park. I want resilient wealth creation. And so that just deeply resonates, and that then becomes kind of part of my personal canon of what I want to live by.
It's interesting reading a little on Picasso and Jimi Hendrix. They were both incredibly talented at the fundamental level, right? But then over time, they developed their own style. It's not like Picasso just started drawing like that from day one, right? He's a classically trained artist and cloned others and learned the foundations. And over time, he developed his own style. And to your point about yourself and Monish, I think you hit on that really well.
And I think actually you get a really important point, Blas, and sorry to interrupt you, which is that
Yeah.
even when you're trying to clone, you end up being original. And that to me is a great relief. So I don't think you can really clone to some degree. To some degree, because it's not you, you end up being more original than you expected. And so even in writing this book, I was very consciously reverse engineering what people like Malcolm Gladwell or Atul Gawande or Oliver Sacks had figured out about how to write and how to structure a book. But at this, so one of the things that Gladwell does, I'm sure most of you have read several of his books, is he'll take an idea and he'll illustrate the idea with several characters and several examples, right? And he does it in a very colorful way. And so I'm like, okay, that's a very powerful way to do it. Whereas Oliver Sacks, who I think is really wonderful, will take a character, case study of his, and then the ideas will flow out of the character, right? So it's a different approach. And so part of what I was doing when I was starting to write this book was, which of those things am I going to do? And so I started writing about Templeton, and it was really kind of a profile that led to these ideas. And then I was reading it and I talked to my editor and I suddenly realized, bugger, I've done it the wrong way. And actually it needs to be the other way. It's more Gladwellian. It's more the ideas illustrated. So say an idea like simplicity that's then illustrated by Joe Greenblatt, Will Danoff, Jack Bogle, Bill Miller. They're all kind of variations on a theme. But then I have this problem that if you look at something like The Tipping Point or Blink or something like that, Gladwell is really taking one big idea and then illustrating it in all of these chapters. And for my book, I'm trying to clone Gladwell, and I'm like, no, but I have like 10 ideas, and I don't really have one big idea. And so even when I was trying to clone him, I couldn't really, because mine is a different problem. It's like I'm taking stuff from him, but mine is actually a different problem. And then I started to think, well, so if there's one idea at the heart of this, what is it? And I'm thinking, well, I guess all of these people are stacking the odds in their favor in different ways with their behavior and their ways of thinking. And so that kind of, in a sense, that's the master principle of my book. These are all different variations on that theme of how do you tilt the playing field to your advantage, both in markets and life. But it's a sort of bad cloning of Gladwell and Gawande. So despite myself, it ends up actually being sort of cloned, but sort of not. It's actually kind of really original. It's not quite what anybody else has done. And then I'm cloning things like, there was a wonderful British biographer called Richard Holmes who wrote he wrote a book called Footsteps that's very interesting. That's about the process of writing biographies. And he did a wonderful biography of Coleridge, a 2-part biography of Coleridge that I read in my early 20s that just absolutely possessed me. And he had this amazing use of footnotes, where the footnotes were really funny, and it was a whole different conversation, basically. And so I'm like, my footnotes are going to be funny. I don't care what anybody says. I'm just going to stick weird shit in the footnotes. And so I don't know, if you look in my footnotes, there's like some weird stuff. I mean, there's something at one point where I say, explaining why Munger is not nearly as rich as Buffett. And I'm sort of explaining this, and I say, where he had these other careers, whereas Buffett has been compounding, since he was in the womb. And so in a weird sense, that's like, nobody's telling me I can't make a joke in the footnote. Like, who's to say? And so I'm sort of cloning Richard Holmes, but I'm sort of doing it in a way that's true to myself. And this is a weird digression. I'm sorry to interrupt you and take you off it, but I actually think, I think it relieves a bit of the strain, the mental strain of thinking, God, it's kind of shameful to be cloning other people. I think, no, you're going to be original whether you like it or not.
Good point, William. Switching gears a little bit, I worked for a large endowment for a number of years, and one of the big benefits there is we had this enormous repository of investor letters and everything that I was able to get my hands on. And one of the more influential was Nick and Zach's at Nomads, and they seem to have become a little bit more common. People have heard of them a little bit more today. It seems like maybe just this past year. But 5 years ago, it seems like no one had really heard of them. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, after you dug into them and spoke to them, what did you learn? And the destination analysis and the scale economics share, these are incredible mental tools. So anyway, I leave it open to you, but what did you learn from Nick and Zach?
I learned so much from Nick and Zach, and particularly from Nick, just because I spent more time with him. But I think about these things a lot. Like I was thinking about this even this morning, that there's a footnote where I said, I mean, this is one of the strangest investment books ever, right? Like I would be asking these people, so do you believe in God? And I mean, these are not questions that most investors are asked, I suspect. And I remember Nick saying to me, I think Nick actually is a very spiritual person, and he reads every day. He was getting like this text about the Bible that he would read, like some sort of blog about the Bible, and he was also reading like Buddhist stuff the whole time. He like me, his mind is like, he's not as disorderly as me, but he's synthesizing stuff from everywhere. Whereas Zach has this narrower, very brilliant, sort of intense intelligence, and so they complement each other very well. But one of the things when I said to Nick, when I was talking to him about God, he said, I believe in good. And he said, and that's enough for me. He said, I believe that good things grow. And that's a really interesting and profound idea, that good things grow. And so there's this great emphasis in Nick's life on quality and goodness and decency and kindness. And so this is one of the things that I hope kind of comes through in that chapter. I think a lot of people are focusing on scale economy shared and stuff like that. That chapter's probably had the biggest impact on readers so far. And I think there's great profundity in the lessons from Nick and Zach that I'm trying to share. But I think in some sense, what's happening in that chapter, if you believe in, say, power versus force, and what Hawkins is saying is, I think Nick and Zach make you go strong when you read it, that there's something about their behavior that makes you go strong. And so when you see, so I think you should be focusing on kind of the soft lessons in that chapter as well. So for example, when Nick says there's great kindness in our relationship between Nick and Zach, that's a really interesting thing, right? Like that they're these partners who returned the money, how many years ago is this? 10 years ago, 9 years? I can't remember, right? Quite a long time ago. They still have an office that they share on the King's Road, which is this kind of beautiful, airy office at the top of a building with their beekeeper suits. And it's got, like Zach's plush leather armchair. And they just sit there they don't go there that often, but they're sitting there completing each other's sentences. And what you're seeing there is this real love between them, this kindness and decency. And when they were setting up the fund, Nick in some ways was kind of the alpha dog, right? Like he's really handsome and he's really charming and he's confident. And Zach is like a little more nervous. Zach is lovely, a really lovely guy, really bright and funny and self-aware and super articulate. But he's like more sort of nebbishy, like kind of nervous. And and Nick was more experienced in some ways, like he'd managed money before. And so it was really, you could easily say, well, Nick would be the alpha dog and would be like the lead, and he was the one who invited Zach to be the partner. But they structured, so Nick was like, let's just have it 50-50. And Zach was like, no, you give me 49% and you have 51%. And if we ever have a conflict, you'll make the decision and I'm going to trust you to make the decision. And Nick said to me, just think about that. Here's this guy passing you the revolver and saying, here, shoot me if you want. And he's like, how could I possibly treat someone like that badly? And when Guy Spear started trying to be sort of a better person and trying to be more of a giver, he said you would sometimes attract these takers who just wanted to kind of exploit you, but you kind of, that's a downside of it, but you figure it out fairly soon who's approaching life as a zero-sum game and who's really a giver. And I think that's the thing with, there is a downside to behaving that way, to trusting people. But I think it's so powerful because you bring into your life these extraordinary people. And so I think there are some really soft lessons from that chapter that are exquisitely important, that make you think, oh, that's how I want to be. And so that idea, even where Nick said to me, good behavior has a longer shelf life. That's a really interesting and profound idea. And so I hope that while people who are much smarter about money than I am are going to be figuring out, here's how I clone scale economies shared, I actually think it's really easy for people to miss these other lessons there about kindness, good behavior, the belief that good things grow. And then this very important idea, that's separate idea, which is that they've set their lives up in a countercultural way so that their environment is peaceful and calm. And so while everyone else is focusing on the short term, on these quick hits of energy, like, let me check my email, let me check my Twitter, let me get this like, let me get this quick hit on this stock, they've shifted everything towards the long term. And so there's this countercultural move that I think there's enormous profundity in, and I think about that a lot. And so there's a kind of concealed element within that chapter, which is that this is one of the great Kabbalistic teachings, is that you want to try to defer gratification. And so in some sense, there is an element of it being a stealth spiritual book that I think I'm sort of enclothing these deep, timeless principles, or trying to, within the lives of people who've been very successful in the practical real world. But what's really going on there, if you go back to the Old Testament, and I'm not saying this as a sort of proselytizer or saying that these stories are exactly true, because one of the things I love about the Kabbalists is that they say, if you believe that these stories are literal, Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, said, better that you were never born. They regard these as codes that are basically telling you about how to behave and how to operate in life. And so if you look at the Old Testament, you see someone like Joseph setting aside 7 years of grain or whatever during the seven great years, and then as a result they get to survive during the 7 lean years. And so this is an act of deferred gratification. And then if you look at Esau kind of selling his birthright for a bowl of lentil soup, that's the ultimate kind of instant gratification. So I think these great lessons are kind of encoded in the Old Testament. I think people like the Buddha taught them, Jesus taught them. These are simple things that we actually already know intuitively. And so you're not, it's kind of like Jesus saying the kingdom of heaven is within. It's like you're not looking for this great wisdom outside or this God outside. It's like it's here. It's like we already know this stuff. And so you're kind of revealing things that you already know to be true. And so when I look at someone like Nick and Zach, I'm like, they're operating in a way that we know to be true. We know that it's better to behave well to your partner. We know that it's better to not try to gouge your shareholders. And so I think they were looking at Buffett and Munger and thinking, look at that partnership. Look. So when you see the forward of Janet Lowe's biography of Munger, and Buffett says, in 41 years, I've never seen Charlie try to take advantage of anyone. And I've seen him take less of the credit and more of the blame, and get the worst side of deals with me. They've tapped into this kind of timeless principle, and in a sense, Nick and Zach see that, and they're like, yeah, that's how we want to behave. And so I think what this book is, I'm how to live in a kind of advertising, it's internet unstable. I hope you hear me. I'm trying to figure out how to live and I'm trying to distill from these people what works and what doesn't work and why, as Charlie Munger would say. And so part of it is just finding good examples of what I think is exemplary behavior and saying, yeah, let me try to be a little more like that, despite the fact that, I'm just as prone to checking my Amazon ranking, whether people like me on Twitter, whether they're, going to get, the extra donut or whatever, here I know all of this stuff from Dean Ornish, and I had a chocolate bar hidden in my desk yesterday that I ate while my wife wasn't looking. And so, it's like I know all of this stuff about deferred gratification. And yet here I am on like my 23rd cup of coffee, and hopefully later I'll be eating some chocolate. Sorry, you never know when I'm going to finish because I keep going on and on. It's all yours.
No, it's wonderful, William. I apologize. I think my internet is a little scratchy, but I heard everything there, and it makes a ton of sense. And a mentor of mine has a beautiful phrase: "Go positive and go first." And I think that's what.
Yeah, that's Peter Kaufman, right?
That's right. Yeah, and
that's a very profound idea.
It's incredible, right? And it's scary, right? Because we have this loss aversion, and we're scared of looking foolish, but how often do people really mistreat you when you go out of your way to be truthful, to be kind, to be thoughtful? And it is scary, right? And that's why going first is such a powerful move, because you show the other person your intention and what you're going for. But anyway, it's these beacons of light that we can clone and emulate and look up to are so powerful.
Yeah, and I think at a certain point you want to try. I mean, wasn't it Buffett who said, look around your classroom and think what are the great characteristics that these people have, and then let me embody that. And I think that's again a simple idea. It's like let me just try to be more. Something we're about pounding, and I think, I've been studying a lot of this stuff, Kabbalistic stuff, for about, I'd say, 13 years. And one of the things that makes life difficult is when you start adopting something that you think is good, you don't really have evidence that it's going to work, right? So there's this sort of leap of faith. It's kind of like compounding. It's like literally patient, resilient that I invest. Else is kind of trying to gallop out on and all of this stuff. And it takes a while to see that it really works, that over time it really works, this type of behavior. But what I find after like this sort of 13-year experiment is that when you pound some of these very powerful positive principles in your head every day, it does rewire you. It rewires your brain, so you actually start to believe the shit that you originally were trying to do. It's kind of like when Guy said to me, he started off trying to be less selfish and kinder and more sharing and to compound goodwill, partly of reciprocation, right? If he just compounded goodwill, there'd be so much reciprocation that would benefit him in his career and his life and everything. At a certain point, actually it changes your wiring, and you just become so addicted to the idea of compounding goodwill that I can just see Guy gets tremendous pleasure out of just being kinder to people. And then there's so much goodwill towards Guy, like everywhere I go, there's goodwill towards Guy. And so it's what this idea, I write about this when I write about Paul Lancet, and I sort of drop these little things in that I hope some people will take really seriously, but I gloss over them sufficiently quickly that it's easy to miss them. But I say that Lancet's process of repetition, his habit of repetition of, say, reading Phil Fisher 40 to 60 times or reading The Intelligent Investor 40 to 60 times, I say it's similar to doing affirmations or daily prayers. And so that's because I'm not in a very self-righteous sort of proselytizing kind of way. I try to do daily prayers most days. And there's something about, and I'm truly not saying this in a sort of proselytizing way, and I'm wary of saying this, and Templeton would be laughing at me since I dismissed him because I was an atheist at the time. But I think there's something that the ancients sort of figured out about this process of repetition that is so powerful cumulatively over time. And so, so I sort of do on the whole, I do this kind of half-assed kind of buffet approach to like this sort of Kabbalistic prayer book where there are certain things where, for example, there's a prayer, the word, which truth, and so it's all about your conscience, right? So some of you will know Hebrew way, know Torah way better than me, so I apologize for any mistakes I'm making. But you're thinking, it's the intention is really important. So you're thinking, let me connect to the power of truth. Let me be more truthful. And so if every day as part of my morning connection, I'm thinking, let me connect to the power of truth. Let me try to become more truthful. Let me try to become a force for truth. Or every day, there's a wonderful teacher of mine who just said, you're just asking to be a conduit and a resting place for the light. That's such an exquisite idea. And if you just say to yourself throughout the day, and he said, this is a consciousness you want to be repeating to yourself all day. Like this is, so for me, because I have this kind of scattered mind, I write down these things in the back of my prayer book. So the very last thing that I do at the end of my half-assed prayer, where I don't have a minion of 10 people or something, I'm not doing anything in the right way. But at the end, I'm thinking there are certain things that I'm coming back to every day. And so, for example, there's this beautiful idea that I saw Cory Booker quote, which is Gamsu Latova, which just means, and this too is for the best. And so you're constantly reminding yourself that, yeah, even when things seem negative, this too is for the best. And whether that's true or not, when you rewire yourself to think, no, this is light as well. Like even when I'm getting the shit kicked out of me, even when I fail at something, no, this is light too. But at some point, you've rewired your consciousness by reminding yourself these principles that you believe every day. So it actually becomes true for you. So now when I have, if I have an argument with my wife or I behave crappily to my daughter or son or something, and I'm like, I can't believe, that's really that after all these years, that's how I behave. I'm like, okay, this too is from the light. Let me think what I'm supposed to learn here. Let me try to recalibrate. Let me try to get back to behaving decently. And okay, it's good. It's good. It's all good. It's all from the light. And so again, sorry if this sounds sort of proselytizing, because it's not meant to be, because I think this is a deeply internal thing that I'm just sort of slightly sheepishly sharing with you because I hope it's hopeful. But I think that process of finding a few things that are approximately true, at least over time, and pounding them into yourself daily is like compounding. It's like you only see the benefits after many years. And so there's a leap of faith in stepping on that path, because you're like, maybe I should just have this zero-sum game approach to life. And it should be, let me look out for myself at someone else's expense and put myself, and so many people are doing it that way, that you're like, well, maybe that is the smart approach. Maybe I'm just a fool, and I'm credulous. And I think it takes it's like Guy says it, most people don't stick with writing thank you letters because it takes about 5 years to see the benefit of having just written so many thank you letters that people are full of goodwill. And I've, of course, never bothered to do that. I can't even order like letterhead paper. It's been on my list of things to do for like probably 25 years to order paper with a letterhead. But yeah, that idea of finding a few good habits or a few good principles that you just keep pounding in, you keep coming back to. For me, in a complex world where I don't understand much, that's very powerful. And Nick Sleep said this, where he said, look, once I realized this thing about scale economies shared, it's like everything else seems a bit crap in comparison. And he said, once you realize that was the single best idea we were probably ever going to have, you just want to fill your portfolio with things that live by that one, that accord to that one great principle. And so I think one of the reasons why Nick opened up to me was because I think we were sort of wrestling with the same questions. We were sort of thinking about the same things. And so there's something really wonderful when you just find other people who are sort of on the same path as you, who are kind of trying to think through, how do I live? How do I behave? How do I invest in a thoughtful way with patience? How do I operate with integrity? And so I suspect that's why Nick resonates with so many people, is that you sort of smell that it's the right way to behave.
Yeah.
But it's a wise way to behave.
Yeah. And it's energizing, right? And we can use the airy terms from David Hawkins, or we can try to make it more concrete, but it's, the term, are they energy vampires, or do they add energy to you? And
Yeah,
that
or
could be a person.
does it make you go strong or does it make you go weak?
That's right.
It's an amazingly helpful filter. And so even when I was thinking of what the title should be for my book, I was like, well, richer, wiser, happier. I don't know if richer makes you go strong, but wiser and happier, they make you go strong. And so I think that becomes a really interesting filter. Like, how do you, and there's another post-it here, if I can find it. It's behind my lamp here, that says, it says something about, this is from Power versus Force. He says, wisdom can ultimately be reduced to the simple process of avoiding that which makes you go weak. Nothing else is really required. Now, I think that's sort of true. I mean, I think it is true, but I actually think it's, instead of focusing on avoiding things that go weak, you want to say, let me focus on things that make you go strong. And so I'm pretty sure that if I'm kinder and more loving and more compassionate, in a complex world over time, those things are going to work pretty well.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, and I think things that are positive actually make you go strong. I'm expressing this kind of wrong, but there's an important idea here, which is that instead of focusing on things like shame and guilt and anger and stuff like that, if Hawkins is right, that there's this sort of, and who knows, I mean, if he's right, that there's this kind of, this scale where, certain things just have so much power, like love, mercy, kindness, all of these things. I think they so overwhelm the negative things that instead of focusing on just how not to be negative, you just want to like talk about, you just want to focus on the positive the whole time. So so I would sort of invert what he's done there in that quote and say, no, that instead of just avoiding the negative, the things that make you go weak, let me flood the zone with the things that make you go strong. And that may or may not be true. I don't know whether any of this kinesiology stuff that Hawkins did is at all replicable or is bullshit or not. But I think it's kind of like looking at the Old Testament and saying that it's it may not be literally true, but it encodes all of these really important timeless principles. And I think that's the case with Hawkins as well. I read his books, I'm like, there's deep truth here that I kind of want to live by.
Yeah, I fully resonate with that, William. And I want to be respectful of your time. This has been amazing. And Charlie Munger has this line that you don't only want to be proud of the results that you have, but how you attain them. And it seems like you're living a life and going through it in a way that it's honorable. And just thank you for your time today. It's been such a pleasure to learn from you. And
thank you. You should though remember my behavior when no one's watching is pretty awful some of the time. And so yeah, before you guys conclude that I'm this righteous individual, you should see me when the TV clicker isn't working. So yeah, I still have a long way to go, but yeah, we're all on this path together. I think trying to figure out how to be better individuals. And I do think there's something wonderful about the idea of a more enlightened type of capitalism that I hope that you guys continue on this track of trying to be more Mungerian and more like sleep. It just works better, I think.
Absolutely. With that, William, we will sign off. But again, thank you for your time. This was wonderful.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.